Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Dark Figures of Crime with Damian Moore is an American Crime Journal production that is a vlog and podcast. It could be viewed, heard at AmericanCrimeJournal.com, YouTube, or your favorite podcatcher where available. All sources utilized in this episode can be found at AmericanCrimeJournal.com accompanying this episode.
This guy was a scumbag, though. I mean, I really don't care.
Me a name, but I'm going to call him Harry. That's it, all right?
Harry Edward Greenwell.
They had the right name, everybody. Boom! American Crime Journal had the right name.
He was known
Like that this is an American. You know, white girls are being abducted and sold into sex trafficking cabals overseas and in Mexico.
Award-winning Utah reporter Lynn Packer detailed why he believes it was all a hoax in an investigative piece last August for the American Crime Journal.
The right-wing obsession with pedophilia and human trafficking. For years now, the primary focus of Lynn Packer and I's reporting centers on human trafficking, which is very much a 21st century hysteria based on and rooted in the white slavery hysteria of the 1900s, which was utilized to steer public perception and to justify racist and discriminatory laws and practices against both blacks, natives, and Hispanics, but also minority Europeans that immigrated to the United States. This was used to stoke fear, hate, and violence against those people. This would surface again with the fears of the opium dens being a front to get white women hooked on opium, just to pimp them out, because the cornerstone of all these white slavery human trafficking myths are that white women are the prize. Now, as we reported, human trafficking is a very real thing, but not to the degree, size, and scope, and most certainly not the myth of the white suburban girls are kidnapped, drugged, chained, and pimped out, to the point that an entire anti-human trafficking apparatus has grown and been a massive criminal racket itself. In reality, just as we reported, this hysteria obfuscates the very real epidemic of child sex abuse. Pedophilia is rampant. Majority being perpetrated by family members, friends, and trusted individuals of these victims. Yet there is this disturbing focus by churches, which today serves as the foundation for right-wing ideology, with illusions of family values and Christian views and the nuclear family. Their entire focus is on the LGBTQ community as if they are the predominant problem. Just as human trafficking, it obfuscates the real victims and protects the perpetrators. In reality, the majority of the perpetrators are straight males abusing little girls. And if we were really to get precise, we are talking about white men with a criminal justice system that disproportionately targets black men, which ultimately, in the end, is failing these victims. Right now, more clergy sexually abuses children than gay men. But frauds and charlatans, religious fundamentalists like Franklin Graham and Tim Ballard and the Republican Party continue to perpetuate that because you say the word gay, teach it in school, or if there are gay characters in a TV show or you're fighting for trans rights, that is child abuse and pedophilia. They have made this political, rooted in religious fundamentalism. This is a major problem in which hundreds of thousands of children each year suffer from sex abuse, neglect, and mental and physical abuse, which all other violence pales in comparison to. This is the right-wing obsession with pedophilia and human trafficking. These are dark figures of crime. Let's talk about what human trafficking really is, and we'll get into some of the more specifics of why that is. So back in 2000, there was a radical shift from the definition of human trafficking. Here is the United Nations definition of human trafficking. Human trafficking is the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power, or of the position of vulnerability, or giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. Now, a lot of people get confused with that last part of the definition when they hear the giving and receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent. That is not to achieve the consent of the person. That is getting the consent from another person. That would be like me giving you money to have consent over your daughter. That is what human trafficking is. Today, the right wing has sort of changed it into this thing about pornography and prostitution, and it has nothing to do with that. Statistics have proven again and again there is no gateway between the two. What they'll try to do is try to say that, oh, well, there's this big pipeline from. No. There's some good documentaries on prostitution and some good studies on it, but there's also some good documentaries on pornography and how that industry kind of works. They call it a 3-month cycle. A girl will actually go into Hollywood or wherever it is, San Fernando Valley, and they'll go down there. And what they'll do is they'll do all these sex acts. They'll have all these pictures, all these videos they do. They make good money for it. But what they don't realize is that all that material is just going to get cut up and distributed and bought by a bunch of websites. Well, guess what? We don't need you anymore. We already have you in a nurse's outfit. We already have you in a cheerleader outfit. We already have you on the couch. We already have you. It's a lot of work in a 3 or 4 month period. These girls get burnt out and there's no use for them. So what ends up happening? They either have to go into more hardcore porn, or some of them delve into prostitution. Others just go home and have to get a job. That's the extent of it. Tim Ballard will tell you that the gateway is that these pornographers are actually selling women to these overseas pimps. There is no case in which that's happened. It's just a disgusting myth, and Ballard and these organizations perpetuate it. Actual human trafficking is usually done by the family. Oh, wait a minute. This is something that goes against Republican family values message. This is why they focus on like third world countries. This is why they, go overseas and stuff like that. They don't want to talk about the real problem of child sex abuse, and human trafficking is actually like less than 0.1% of the actual sex abuse of children, yet it is the main theme that you hear a lot of these Republicans talk about. Now, as I stated before, since I began investigating Tim Ballard and Operation Underground Railroad, I have reviewed over 1,000 human trafficking cases, dated from between 2017 to 2019, which was about all of the federal prosecutions. And there were a few common denominators. Vast majority, there was no child, there was no pimp. In fact, it was men doing what Tim Ballard was doing for the Department of Homeland Security. They were posing as little boys and soliciting pedophiles with money in exchange for sex. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not human trafficking. No child was trafficked, period. Believe it or not, there were a few cases of actual human trafficking where young Mexican girls, El Salvadorian girls, and some Asian girls, and the majority of them are over 20 years old, And what happened is many were scammed into thinking they were coming to the United States for love or a job or something. Their documents were held hostage, and they were basically forced into prostitution under deception. They had none of their documents. They couldn't speak English, and the only person they could really rely on is their trafficker. You know, they're in a foreign country. They know nobody. They're afraid if they go to the police and they out their situation, they're going to go to jail. They're going to get deported. Out of 1,000, we had less than 100 instances of human trafficking. And I'm being generous here. Now, I have interviewed Carlos Rodriguez. Just as he was flown in to be interviewed by investigators, who was a former executive at Operation Underground Railroad for a very short time. Carlos was a retired Washington State Patrol detective who was the head of the Missing and Exploited Children Task Force known as METCAF, which is who conducted the net nanny stings, which is what put OUR on the map. But I asked Carlos specifically, at any point during this operation, did they ever rescue a child from human trafficking? Do you know what his answer was? None. Not a single child was rescued. Notice there were no kidnappings, chains, or another biblical word they love to use, bondage. Not one single case. It's hard for me to imagine, though, that not a single person out there listening to this does not know a victim of child sex abuse. It's the same with domestic violence. And again, unlike human trafficking, the statistics are really staggering here. As I said, I went through about 1,100 cases of human trafficking. So I want you to listen to these statistics, though. In 2018, the Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families Child Maltreatment Report states that of the 3,534,000 children who were the subject of an investigation, 678,000 children were determined to be the victims of some form of maltreatment. Now, of those 678,000 cases, 60% were the victims of neglect. And some of these cases were just raw and disgusting. You had children that their parents were so uninvolved in their lives that they're feeding themselves at 6 years old and trying to prepare food and things of that nature. 10.7% were physically abused. 7% were sexually abused. More than 15% were the victims of 2 or more abuses. So, like, they might be the victims of neglect and sex abuse. 15%, folks. And for more than a decade, the vast majority of children that entered the foster care system are for neglect. Why hasn't there been noise over that if it's about saving the children? 60% of children. We are talking, folks. 60% of 600, and almost 700,000. Guys, this is like 400,000 children that are the victims of neglect. Oh, where is Tim Ballard and the Republicans on this? Maybe because the vast majority of this occurs in diehard Republican states. Oh, yes, folks. You know, there's a lot of noise about pedophilia and a lot of noise about saving the children, but where is it occurring? Well, we'll get into that here in a moment. Now, what about the 15% of children who enter the foster care system for 2 different forms of abuses, neglect and physical abuse, or physical abuse and sexual abuse. That's more than double than just those that are sexually abused. Probably because the overwhelming majority of physical child abuse actually takes place in Republican states. Now, guys, I know a lot of you are going to be like, you're making these political. No, these are the statistics, folks. And how often have you heard conservative personalities, Ben Shapiro, Tucker Carlson, and religious personalities complain that kids aren't beat like they used to be? You know, spare the rod, spoil the child. I'm sure many of you have heard a conservative uncle or two complain. I have too. Kids just don't get enough discipline. And guys, we know what that means. That means you're not smacking them around or just plain out kicking their ass like they used to. But I can assure you, folks, that states and courts just don't take a person's children because they were smacked around. It takes some serious physical abuse for the courts to take your kids. And when they do take them, conservatives scream government overreach and rally around people to beat their kids. That's because it is a core Christian conservative tenet that one cannot spare the rod. Republicans speak of their children as if they are property without rights, and they have the right to beat them. They have the right to do what they want with the children because it's their child. So I guess it's not about saving the kids, folks. Now we get down to child sex abuse. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been down this road for 50 years. In fact, the 50s were 3 decades past my childhood, and I feel like we're right back there in the 50s. At least Republicans care about sexually abused children, right? Well, like human trafficking, only in fantasy land, or for a very narrow specific type. It's nothing more than a slogan. These satanic democratic cabals. Pedophilia is nothing more than a weapon being used against, and right now more than ever, the trans community. And it's the same recycled fear-mongering hate that was used in the 60s, in the 70s, and then the 80s when HIV and AIDS was on the scene. And like with Tim Ballard and human trafficking, all that matters is the end result. It's like business and sports, science and medicine. What are those end results? Nearly 75% of all the children sexually abused are females, and the perpetrators are males. But we don't hear about that from Republicans and the right wing, because over 2/3 of sexual predators are white males. That's right, folks. It's over 66%. But the GOP wants to focus on black men raping white women, and even more emphasis these days because of the whole race issue. They want to focus on boys being molested by gay men. But it's about saving the children, right? So, here's what it comes down to. What are the top 10 states with the toughest laws against child sex abuse? Since that's the only abuse that Republicans care about is pedophilia, not a single Republican state ranked in the top 10. What about the top 15 states with the highest concentration of sex offenders? 10 of the 15 states with the highest concentration of sex offenders were core Republican states. Do we see a pattern here? Why is this? It's not a coincidence that the vast majority of victims of sex abuse and sexual violence are little girls and women. Yet the GOP leaders and philosophers, the brains of these people, like the Ben Shapiros, the Tucker Carlsons, want to scream and cry about men's rights. It's disgusting that they would even try to remotely conflate the two here. The main problem right now, and why far-right ideology has become mainstream, isn't just the people pushing this nonsense. There is a lack of people, moderate Republicans, moderates, and Democrats alike, not so much as debunking it, but not demonstrating and putting out real statistics addressing the very real issue and core problem of child sex abuse. But it's worse than that. The moment you point out the culture of pedophilia throughout American history and throughout world history, and the fact that the vast majority of sex abuse is committed in the home, that heterosexual adult male on females who are minors is over 75% of all sex abuse, that there has been a long culture in the very heart of QAnon's base of child sex abuse and physical abuse. Spare the rod, spoil the child, right? Teenage girls getting married in rural communities, both in the Midwest and South. The LDS Church's history is replete with teen marriages, polygamy, and human trafficking. And we'll touch on this for just a moment. Remember Ballard's parable? His story of the young Mormon men being seduced by these black and brown girls. And if he takes the girls out of the equation, he goes and rescues them, then Mormon men will not be tempted. And I cannot tell you how many LDS women have told me about bishops and the communities placing pressure on teen girls to make sure that they don't put a young Mormon man's priesthood at risk. To not be provocative or tempt them, and if these boys try any acts beyond kissing, to stop it and report them to the bishop, so both of them can be drilled during a Mormon masturbation interview. Again, it's placing responsibility on the girl for a man's actions. This is patriarchy. This is enabling young men, raising them in a culture where they have no accountability. Sadly, as pedophilia continues to feature prominently in the diatribes of far-right Republican ideology, not a single GOP state breaks the top 10 when it comes to laws protecting children from abuse. The moment you start to bring out the facts about child sex abuse, human trafficking, and such, you are branded a leftist, a Democrat, a socialist, or pedophile lover, even though we're talking about real victims, not fantasy ones. Moderates, both Republicans and Democrats, are the largest enablers. They are the ones who will say, it's not a political issue, it's on both sides. And they're right, it's not a political issue. Most issues are not political. Abortion is a medical and scientific issue, not a political one, but it's been made a political one. There is no reason for the Bible to be used in public policy or political pandering. The issue of gay marriage, again, the Bible is fantasy and fiction. Plus, we are supposed to have a separation of church and state because our founding fathers knew just how dangerous Christian fundamentalism could be. It is essential that we tear down this dangerous and deadly QAnon and right-wing ideology and its varieties that are being pumped by men like Tim Ballard. Satanic panic and nonsense like this is okay for these NGOs because it makes them rich. And the reason why moderate Republicans and conservatives don't publicly dismantle and put forth policies and agenda that would actually protect children is because they benefit from this regardless. They don't have to pander it, they just don't have to confront it. and it keeps peace within the party, while real children in these states continue to be neglected and abused. For 40 years, Republicans have accused Democrats of being soft on crime. Rather than pointing out the facts, the GOP is using 40-year-old data, such as New York City homicides. As New York homicides are down from 2,000 30 years ago to just 300 and 400, and the city population has increased immensely. Crime is at historic lows. Violent crime in America is as low as it was in the 1960s. And we have 150 million more people. Of the top 10 most violent states in America, 9 are Republican states. Of the top 10 states with the highest murder rates per capita, 9 are Republican. Now, a lot of news outlets reported only 8 were Republican, and Georgia is on that list, and they list it as Democrat. Look, it's got a GOP governor, GOP Secretary of State, and GOP Attorney General. It is a Republican state and has been for decades, period. Instead of actually putting laws in place, like age of consent, raising it federally to the age of 18 so there is no confusion in any state, which I have long advocated for, instead, they cook up ways to attack prostitution and pornography, where our focus and law enforcement's focus needs to be if the real goal is to eradicate child sex abuse, exploitation, and trafficking, and use facts and evidence-based data and identify the real problems. It's rooted in education and funding, mandatory reporting, providing education to children at an early age, letting them know about predatory behavior in adults, but also setting up not just a method of reporting to where it is comfortable for the child, but an entire apparatus that would transition an abused child from talking to adults to getting them into a protected environment until investigations can be completed. And if it is found that sexual abuse has occurred, then these individuals need to be arrested and prosecuted. But here's the problem. In Republican states, they have continually stripped funding from the government, from their child protective services and Department of Children and Family Services, whatever those states may call it, under the guise that this is some type of funding for welfare queens. Child neglect, as we talked about, is 60% of all child maltreatment, and GOP states wanted to completely gut lunch and breakfast programs for children. What they fail to realize is that sometimes that lunch at school is the only meal they're getting. And this is why breakfast was essential. It at least got them 2 meals a day, but they cut that funding. It was welfare. Unfortunately, priest and clergy penitent privilege is a major problem in this country. They should be mandatory reporters. And folks, this is across the board. This isn't just a GOP problem. We are talking states like Oregon and California has clergy penitent privilege in place. Why are priests, rabbis, bishops, deacons not being required to report children, women, and men that are in imminent danger by a member of their congregation? Listen, if it's something that happened 50 years ago, that's one thing. But if it's an ongoing problem, why isn't the culture around penance being told that you need to come forward and accept responsibility and that you are accountable for your actions. And most importantly, your child, your children that are in your care need to be protected from you. This is nothing but enabling this behavior. What this does is it gives these men, these predators, a way to ease their conscience, to feel the burden of guilt lifted off of them so that they can continue to abuse guilt-free, that they could beat their wives guilt-free, that they could sexually abuse their daughters or their nieces or nephews guilt-free. It is a disgusting ecosystem within itself, and nobody is talking about this. The Violence Against Women Act, passed back in 1994 and signed into law by President Bill Clinton, is a shell of its former self. In 2012, Republicans fought tooth and nail to prevent its reauthorization, and they succeeded. The GOP Congress gutted protections for Native Americans, foreigners in our country, which in turn left Latin and South American women, who today are the largest at risk for human trafficking, with no legal protections. It left the boyfriend loophole open, which allowed boyfriends accused of domestic violence to buy guns. The government shutdown in late 2018 allowed the Violence Against Women Act to expire again. On April 4, 2019, the House, controlled by Democrats, passed a reauthorization act, and it closed the boyfriend loophole, but it still was a shell of its former self. Sadly, the NRA opposed the bill, and the Republican-controlled Senate refused to get it passed. As a result, in December of 2019, a Houston police officer would be murdered by her boyfriend, who purchased firearms after she pressed charges against him for domestic violence. Houston Police Chief Art Acevedo called out Ted Cruz and John Cornyn, the two senators from Texas, and Senate Leader Mitch McConnell for preventing the passage of the Violence Against Women Act. Finally, on March 22, 2022, President Biden reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act, passed by a Democrat-controlled House and Senate. The NRA and virtually all Republicans opposed it. But it's about saving the children, folks, right? Republicans and their pundits have sold the myth of woke culture and cancel culture to cover for their racism, misogyny, and pedophile obsession that is rooted in Jewish blood libel. But they have also harnessed white rage and have made them into victims. So Democrats are afraid if they use data and facts, it's going to feed into white rage. And this is embarrassing. There is a reason why 76% of all ideological-driven violence, hate crimes, are rooted in right-wing political ideology and Christian fundamentalist beliefs. Yet right-wing pundits and GOP legislators push fear and paranoia over Antifa and Sharia law. Why do you think abortion clinics are bombed? Black churches and Jewish synagogues are being primary targets, supermarkets in black neighborhoods. Hate crimes against the LGBTQ community has increased 300%, and domestic violence is on the rise. It is absolutely cowardice and willful ignorance when moderate Republicans attempt to downplay and dismiss the big lie, these slurs like pedophile, and the diatribes of far-right leaders in QAnon as just fringe or far-right. Michael Flynn, Lynn Wood, Matt Gaetz, Steve Bannon are not just some fringe figures with a handful of followers. Instead, these are mainstream players of many who have worked at the highest levels of government and are best friends with the former President of the United States, Donald Trump. Bannon and Flynn were key figures who influenced and steered Trump administration policy. Today, far-right ideology is mainstream. It is the influence and concepts of GOP policy and agenda. We cannot just sit by, play stupid, or be afraid of being accused and disparaged as some woke leftist, socialist, or pedophile lover for simply diagnosing mainstream far-right ideology for what it is. People are getting killed, and innocent men and women's lives are being destroyed by these people. There is no mistake. This is a war on women, and this is a war on the LGBTQ community. This is a jihad on America under this fiction, this fantasy that left-wing ideology is just taking over America. The thought leaders on the right, mainstream GOP politicians like Donald Trump, Dan Crenshaw, DeSantis, use the buzzwords and imaginary enemies and this imaginary war against them to build their coalition and to rile their base. It is no mistake that these GOP senators and congressmen, those seeking office, have campaign ads of them hunting leftists and killing imaginary Antifa and Black Lives Matter. People like Michael Flynn, Lynn Wood, and Jim Caviezel and Tim Ballard, who blend in and out of the mainstream in right-wing media, what is their biggest complaint? Cancel culture. Their biggest fear is advertisers, sponsors, subscribers, and donors pulling out, not over ideas or jokes. That's the ruse. Hate speech and the devaluation of transgender people's lives, Black lives, women's lives, Hispanics' lives, Muslims' lives. It is essential to their survival. The victimization of white men, martyrdom and white rage, it's profitable and it drives results. Let's be honest for 1 minute here, ladies and gentlemen. I bet that the slaves wished the only thing they ever had to worry about was cancel culture. I bet women during suffrage, Black Americans during civil rights, feminists, and the LGBTQ community wished the biggest issue they would face is cancel culture. Is this how pathetic, weak, and desperate white men have become? Jordan Peterson, who has been deified by young Christian white men simply because he told them to stand up straight and to clean their room, are deeply troubled, confused, and misguided. Jordan Peterson had a book on the New York Times bestseller list while he was trending #1 on Twitter and #1 on YouTube. He was whining about people trying to cancel him. For those of you that still don't know exactly what white privilege is or think it's a myth, that is white privilege personified. Just because Peterson said some homophobic and misogynistic BS and a few people asked for accountability, he's acting like he was a black schoolgirl who needed the National Guard just to go to school. It is absolutely sickening and disgusting. This is a breeding ground for hate. All this rhetoric, hate, and right-wing propaganda is rooted in the GOP's fantasy culture war. It's only because Democrats and liberals support LGBTQ rights, period. That's why they're being maligned and attacked. Liberals had embraced LGBTQ rights and protections and equality for minorities and women. the Democrat Party began moving their policy positions not only to protect these groups, but to ensure them rights and freedoms that we all enjoy. It is also important to note that the DNC began to root policy decisions based on data, facts, and science, removing the vast majority of Christian ideation out of decisions and policy making, as well as ads and campaigns that were being ran. As neoconservatism took over the GOP, they did the complete opposite. Foreign and domestic policy was rooted and based in white Christian nationalism. This is the sole reason why education, journalism, science, and medicine is accused of being leftist and bastions of leftist ideology. It is simply because the American right bases their policy decisions on Christian values. It has no business in policy in the 21st century. In the very early 90s, majority of educators, scientists, journalists, and medical professionals, almost 70% identified as conservatives. It wasn't because all these people one day got a mystery paycheck from George Soros. Republicans had moved further right and embraced religious fundamentalism to cater to those 30 million votes they were guaranteed every election cycle. This gave birth to the paranoia of left-wing politics taking over America. The DNC, on the world political scale, is a right-wing party. What the American right has done is abandoned all civil liberties and embraced the Bible for policy. The issues of abortion, LGBTQ rights, gay marriage, and even universal health care are not even debated in other westernized nations because conservatives have actually been champions of policies like gay marriage in other countries. So that's why you have things like, well, American politics are different, as if we are ahead of the curve. No, folks, we are 50 years behind civil rights, women's rights, and LGBTQ rights. At no point has any prominent Democrat said, guys, let's normalize pedophilia. But Republicans will say that it's a slippery slope. And this isn't scientific. I guarantee that at least 80% of all Republicans fight against progressive policies is based on this slippery slope. If they do not oppose this so-called gay agenda, then it's a slippery slope. If we do not oppose gay marriage, it's a slippery slope, because then pedophiles will want to get married. The whole pedophilia obsession right now is a coordinated attack against LGBTQ rights. When you see them when we start to push for the rights of the trans people, when we start to push rights and they see gay marriage, they want to try to correlate that there's this big pedophilia problem when you have LGBTQ rights. And you'll see them make these weird comparisons like, well, if we let two men marry, then somebody wants to marry a goat. Very disgusting, and it's a very orchestrated long-term attack. For decades, Republicans and the GOP has tried to disguise homosexuality, or has tried to correlate homosexuality and pedophilia. If there happens to be one or two hit shows with an LGBTQ character, then it's normalizing pedophilia. Tim Ballard said it himself recently. In fact, let's play that video.
So shame on you, people who are trying to make a thing of these numbers and trying and lessen the chance of a woman or child from being rescued. It's sick, and it's interesting. Most of those outlets, by the way, are the ones that are reporting on this. Also have parallel reporting about how pedophilia is normal, and let's not stigmatize people who want to have sex with our children. It's a movement we're battling, and it's disgusting.
Who exactly is Tim Ballard talking about? Or is this a typical right-wing go-to diatribe? Is he talking about The Atlantic, Vice News, American Crime Journal, Lim Packer, myself? Who is running parallel reporting normalizing pedophilia? It's the typical right-wing and Republican go-to response whenever they are questioned or backed into a corner on policy. The same thing happened to Operation Underground Railroad mastermind and conservative commentator Glenn Beck, who shortly after interviewing Tim Ballard, and as Operation Underground Railroad was hoping to become a TV show, which was during the filming of The Abolitionists. Here is a clip of an interview with Glenn Beck 7 years ago when pressed on the transgender bathroom issue. What is his go-to response? Let's take a listen.
Let me just say this. If you don't stand up now, I guarantee you the next thing that will be mainstream, because this is not normal. This is not the way, the velocity of the way this is being jammed down everybody's throat is not normal. This isn't an outcry from the people. No. This is 0.3% of the population. This, when you saw the gay marriage thing, that was pushed through by the administration, but we would have arrived there anyway ourselves. We would have gotten there. Another 5 or 10 years, we would have gotten there anyway. It was already on that path. Transgendered bathrooms have come out of nowhere and are being jammed down our throat. I guarantee you, the next stop on this train is pedophilia. I guarantee it.
There it is, folks. We call this the slippery slope fallacy. Notice Beck doesn't give any reason not to provide a bathroom for transgender people. Simply by providing a bathroom for transgender people, it will lead to pedophilia. Notice Beck concedes on gay marriage, and there's a reason for this. It's because the LDS Church was adopting the Catholic policy on homosexuality, which it doesn't condemn homosexuals, just the acts. Beck, like the LDS Church, was softening their positions. Beck was also in the beginning stages of a downward spiral at this time, but more on that another day. Beck, like all conservatives, justifies reckless and often dangerous policy positions on, well, it might lead to pedophilia or it will lead to pedophilia, just like Beck guaranteed 7 years ago. And then we have Tim Ballard, who, like Beck and all conservatives, defend themselves and attack all critics. They attack journalism, science, medicine, and education with they are trying to normalize pedophilia. For decades, at least since the Reagan administration, conservatives' retort has been the normalization of pedophilia. The audacity of Tim Ballard never ceases to amaze me. Ladies and gentlemen, this is white privilege personified and shameless ignorance on full display. Tim Ballard, who is under multiple criminal investigations, response to valid and proven criticism, immediately plays the victim card and then attempts to smear his critics as trying to hurt children. This is a man who sat by and watched gleefully as an untrained donor given a spot on the jump team as an undercover operative just because he donated millions to Operation Underground Railroad. Ballard sat and watched as not one but two purported child sex slaves got sexually assaulted by his employee. Ballard then threatened and sued the producers of the abolitionists over the footage, and he kept that donor on OUR jump teams for at least another 3 to 4 years. Not long after, an OUR volunteer was sexually assaulted by one of Tim's employees. Ballard then threatened, intimidated, and later harassed that volunteer into silence. Tim Ballard supports the practice of LDS bishops behind closed doors alone with children from 8 to 17 years old and asking them questions like, do they masturbate? Then how do they masturbate? Does their penis get hard? Thinking about girls or thinking about boys? Does it tingle? Did your boyfriend or girlfriend orgasm? I've talked to both current and former members of the LDS Church. All have told me that this is a frequent occurrence and it is sexually abusive. If Tim Ballard was truly interested in fixing pedophilia, they'd start at the ward down the street on Sunday. No, it's not as sexy as posing with machine guns and playing out James Bond fantasies in a third world country, but it actually solves a problem of child sex abuse, a common practice in their own churches and communities. Jewish blood libel has existed for nearly 1,000 years when the Jews of Norwich were falsely accused of ritual murder when white Christians ran around stating that they were in the need of blood of Christian boys to perform rituals. Over the next 50 years, Christian fear and paranoia exploded in England with stories of Jews murdering boys for their blood to perform these rituals, and ultimately it resulted in the massacre of the Jews in London and York. Once Christian fear and paranoia subsided, after looking like the anti-Semitic bloodthirsty animals they were, cooler heads and rational thought prevailed, but that would just be for a little while. Anti-Semitism and radical Christian fundamentalism would rear its ugly head every so often, using child murders and rumors of blood rituals as justification to kill Jewish men, women, and children. Our founding fathers, in all their wisdom, knew about Christian hysteria and the justification of violence all too well. The separation of church and state was not aimed to prevent Muslims or Buddhists from instilling a theocracy in the United States. They were worried about the Christians. This is why they refrained from claiming silly things like America was a covenant with God or a God-given inheritance to Christian white men. They knew all too well how powerful language and ideas were and how they could be misconstrued and used as justification to persecute and kill people. Fast forward to the 1960s and 70s as conservatism grew and began to entertain the evangelical and Christian fundamentalist vote, it led to the hijacking of conservatism and the Republican Party. The GOP and the evangelical community got married, just as Ronald Reagan was sworn into office. Neoconservatism swept the country, and with it came all the paranoia, fears, and fantasies that men could concoct and dream up out of the King James Bible. The fundamentalists were in full control over elected Republicans because they were a reliable 30 million strong voting bloc. Guys, if you remember, There was a big attack on daycare centers. Remember, they were satanic cults. They were pedophiles in there. And this is all an attack on women. This was an attack on feminism. This is an attack on women. This is an attack on women not having their own sexuality or agency. They felt that their type of lifestyle, this nuclear family that they invented, was under attack. So here's an article from Mother Jones. The patriarchal family was under siege as conservatives saw it, and daycare centers had become physical representation of the social forces bedeviling them. You had this Reagan-driven conservative resurgence, Beck says, and daycare was seen as least suspicious, if not an actively malign force of feminism. Daycare held a prominent place in right-wing demonology. As far back as the 1960s, conservatives were warning darkly that child care was a communist plot to destroy the traditional family. As sociologist Jill writes, the color of welfare. In 1971, Richard Nixon vetoed the Comprehensive Child Development Act, which would have established a national daycare system. In his veto message, Nixon used the red baiting language urged upon him by his special assistant, none other than Pat Buchanan, of all people.
Well, I think white men were 100% of the people that wrote the Constitution, 100% of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, 100% of the people who died at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, probably close to 100% of the people who died at Normandy. This has been a country built basically by white folks in this country who are 90% of the entire nation.
Saying that the program would have committed the vast moral authority of national government to the communal approaches of child rearing against the family-centered approach. In a decade of rising divorce rates, at least conspiracism and reactionary social conservatism would enjoy a happy marriage. By the time Judy Johnson came forward in 1983 with allegations that a teacher at the McMartin preschool had molested her child, the country had been primed to assume the worst by more than a decade of child care fear-mongering. Guys, this is exactly what we have been talking about in Lynn Packer's articles. I talked about it in my first two articles when I started investigating Tim Ballard. The demonization of daycares for nearly a decade exploded into full-blown Christian fantasies and fears of flying demons and Satan worshippers, molesting, raping, and sacrificing children in daycares. The subsequent trials of the McMartin preschool were the longest and costliest in American history. Satanic Panic spread like wildfire just as John Walsh's son Adam was abducted and murdered in one of the most high-profile child abduction cases in U.S. history. This, in turn, was the lightning rod and the subsequent conduit for stranger danger hysteria and satanic pedophile cults to merge. Books like Michelle Remembers became all the rage. Talk shows such as Oprah, Donahue, Jenny Jones helped perpetuate this myth and lent it credibility into the American mainstream. Just like Salome Ma'am and Tim Ballard and Operation Underground Railroad today, people like Faye Yeager and her organizations sprung up all over the United States under the ruse of satanic ritual abuse. They helped abusers, controlling grandparents and aunts and uncles and even friends of these children evade court orders, get these children new identities, and put them right into the hands of abusers, pedophiles, and pimps. Satanic Panic became mainstream in America during a time when violence was at its peak. Crack cocaine epidemic swept the nation, and street gangs like the Bloods, Crips, Latin Kings, Gangster Disciples, and Vice Lords went from a dozen guys guarding street corners to multi-million-dollar drug cartels. When the press asked Republican legislators about HIV and AIDS, funding, and education, their rebuttals were swift platitudes and on brand. God was punishing the homosexuals. The internet was just a few years away, but the public was consumed with stranger dangers, satanic cults, and satanic ritual abuse. FM and AM radio exploded in the Midwest and Southern communities, with religious programming in the morning, with pastors screaming about doomsday prophecies. The end was near, but not without the Great Tribulation, these pastors would say. Conservative radio hosts such as Rush Limbaugh, his protege Jim Quinn, and Dennis Prager filled the airwaves. White Americans from the suburbs, the Midwest, Southwest, the Bible Belt, and Deep South were indoctrinated with radical right-wing ideology, with little to no opposition and deprived of actual journalism and education-based programming. From 1987 to 1994, there was a steep rise in not just anti-Semitic hate crimes, but anti-Semitic views by Republicans. The Anti-Defamation League issued a report warning of the growing anti-Semitic views within the Christian right movement, but it would be ignored. Suddenly, journalists, educators, psychologists, and law enforcement realized something far more dangerous was sweeping the United States of America. Far-right Christian groups, militias, and even regular churches throughout the Deep South and Midwest was consuming propaganda. A mixture of doomsday trials and tribulation fear-mongering and warnings of black-on-white crime. White girls being seduced by black men, homosexuals kidnapping and molesting and murdering little boys, satanic pedophiles engaged in ritualistic abuse, feminazis, and peddling fears of whites becoming a minority because of abortion, and the Jewish conspiracies flooded the airwaves. Due to the rhetoric of right-wing politicians, even like Donald Trump and Mo Brooks, Marjorie Taylor Greene, DeSantis, and these conservative thought leaders like Glenn Beck, the late Rush Limbaugh, Ben Shapiro, Dennis Prager, combined with wealthy evangelist ministers like Paula White, Mike Huckabee, Pat Robertson, Greg Locke, and the LDS Church. That path, that foundation that the Reagan administration built 40 years ago, and they thought it was going to be a blueprint for Goldwater conservatism in America. For the first few decades, Buckley and Barry Goldwater were able to keep mainstream conservatism in check, as a core tenet of conservative ideology was the separation of church and state. But that would all change. Thankfully, we had the Supreme Court that put individual liberties above all else. But ladies and gentlemen, those days are over. Pedophilia, human trafficking, child exploitation, slavery, survival sex, and prostitution and pornography are not the same thing. There is a reason why people like Tim Ballard goes to third world countries, religious fundamentalist countries like Afghanistan, where women are forbidden to work. No matter what country you go to, no matter how culturally religious and conservative it is, men abandon women who have no power or say in divorce, separation, until the man decides he's done. Then here is this woman who is viewed as damaged goods. She has 5 kids, and she can't even legally work. And if she does, or if she can, it is a fraction of what a man makes. So what are her choices? Hope a bunch of white men with machine guns come rescue them? This is half the problem with OUR and similar organizations. These countries operate on basically the same misogynistic principles in LDS doctrine, evangelist doctrine, and Muslim doctrine, and they can't stand it. The cure for survival sex is equality, not men with machine guns and a U visa, so Ballard can show them off just in time for a Build the Wall rally. The same men fighting to prevent equality want to make them decent and moral.
So what's that like? That's like saying I went out deep sea fishing for 3 days in the Pacific Ocean, and I only caught, and there's 5 of us, and we only caught 50 fish. Ha! So there's not hundreds of thousands of fish in the Pacific Ocean, is there, JC? There's only, I mean, I caught 50, so what, maybe there's 80? I don't know, I only caught 50. This is the ignorance of our news outlets, okay, of people claiming to be reporters. And what they're doing while trying to make a name for themselves off this movement of human trafficking, they're hurting people. If they turn off someone who might have been instrumental in rescuing a kid, that's on you.
Isn't this one of the most embarrassing analogies that Tim Ballard tried to put together? Not only is it a gross attempt to distort the actual truth, but it's obfuscation at best because Tim knows exactly what we are talking about. Ballard is the one who is misguiding the public with numbers. He says the statistics don't matter, but in fact it's Tim Ballard that's the one that's putting out those numbers of 50 fish and 80 fish and blue fish, red fish, green fish, yellow fish. Tim is essentially trying to say that any criticism of him and his organization is getting children killed. And the best Tim Ballard can do is pick up prostitutes in a foreign country and bring them here in America and try to pass them off as sex trafficking victims. This is pure example of a man that is just so blatantly dishonest and enraged because all of this, folks, is coming to an end. He has not been under a criminal investigation for nearly 2 years by multiple agencies just because they're picking on him. Make no mistake, it is not a coincidence that both young and middle-aged white men are seething with hate, racist, and misogynist views and beliefs. Why they have the motivation to act, stockpiling weapons and doomsday prepping, Facebook messages and manifestos quoting Tucker Carlson and expressing concepts expressed by Ben Shapiro, the late Rush Limbaugh, and Steve Bannon. This is why the lives of Black people, Jews, women, and especially the LGBTQ community, with a specific focus on transgender pronouns, and people of Latin and South American descent have been devalued. Labeled leftists, pedophiles, traitors, illegals, BLM terrorists, and the mythical Antifa. The American right and Republican Party spent decades discrediting education, journalism, and science, using right-wing nonprofits, just like Operation Underground Railroad, and using names that sound close to things like the American Psychological Association or other legitimate medical and scientific organizations to try and pass off right-wing agenda and driven policies rooted in the Bible or in the interests of their corporate donors as if it is legitimate science. If you knew nothing about Operation Underground Railroad and you heard the name, you would think it was some organization preserving the actual Underground Railroad and history of real abolitionists. Perhaps it was an archive or curators of a museum. They do this with medical associations, scientific publications, where they can publish climate change denial propaganda from men with bogus degrees from mail-order universities or some chiropractor school. Ballard, OUR, like all those other anti-trafficking, rescuing girls with Navy SEALs and ex-CIA, centers around a false kidnapping narrative. It doesn't work that way. Not a single case, not a single kidnapping ring has been identified, but ads and advertisements of these organizations center around the kidnapping of suburban white girls. So, nobody is denying that human trafficking exists, but it is almost as if that in the last 7 or 8 years, Tim Ballard hasn't examined a real case. And he's perjured himself in front of Congress. Or does he know exactly what it is, and he's lying in order to get money out of donors? Which is it? It can only be one of the two things. Either he knows what it is, or he doesn't. But if he knows what it is, he knows why he's deceiving donors, and he's doing it for a reason. For 7 years, hundreds of interviews and fundraisers, and he's thrown the same numbers out there. He's thrown the same numbers out of a 10-year-old UN trafficking report that was inaccurate, and admittedly had bad data. Here's Lynn Packer with the report.
Finally, Ballard accused The Atlantic of leaving out his actual numbers about child sex slavery. You know, the 27 million enslaved worldwide, 10 million sex slaves, 2 million children forced into the commercial sex trade.
So this particular article that I'm referring to decided to leave all that out because that would have ruined her story.
Ballard is correct. The Atlantic article did not deal with those figures. But Ballard may be lucky it didn't. My reporting did go into those numbers in great detail in 2015, 7 years ago, and again in 2020. His key sex trafficking numbers have not changed in 7 or more years. 10 million are commercial sex slaves worldwide. 10 million sex slaves. 2 million children trapped as sex slaves. Again, 2 million. 32 billion a year global industry. Still 32 billion a year. Fastest growing criminal enterprise. It's still growing. Even if the numbers and claims were accurate 7 years ago, they would still not be accurate today. But they were not even accurate then, as I reported in 2015.
And he's supposed to be the world's leading expert in human trafficking. And this is not just silly, let's make fun of Tim Ballard and OUR, let's make them look stupid as possible, as Tim claimed. This is dangerous, and it is costing young girls their lives. If you made it this far, good or bad, thank you. This is our first episode. So if it seemed a little bit much or extra, or just an abundance of information, forgive me. We did tackle a pretty complex issue and subject that probably could be an entire season. However, I have to be honest. This nation is in trouble, and it's based and rooted in a very dangerous ideology that is now mainstream. So many people are quick to just brush it off as just fringe far-right ideology. People are getting killed because of the fear, hate, and paranoia being fed to them. There is more to this. The abuse of children has been weaponized, and there is nothing more disgusting that angers people more than child sex abuse. It is a political weapon, and it's just some slogan to get people rich, while the real victims are not even being discussed. Coming up on our next episode, we are going to be talking about the American gun culture. A lot of people want to talk about gun control measures. A lot of people want to talk about arming the teachers. Horrible ideas. But at the end of the day, we need to talk about our own history and our own patriotism that incorporate violence as a way of our culture and identity. All this and more next week on the Dark Figures of Crime. This is Damian Moore. Have a great night. Be safe, everyone. The information, resources, and further reading that accompanies this podcast will be in the respective article at AmericanCrimeJournal.com.